Then, a slow fade into a sweeping aerial shot of a vast, windswept landscape. The drone camera glides over jagged cliffs, across a dried riverbed, and toward a formation of massive stone structures standing silent under a crimson sunset. Their walls are cracked, their foundations half swallowed by earth and vegetation. From above, they resemble the ribcage of some long-dead giant, a skeletal reminder of a city that once pulsed with life. At first glance, these ruins are like thousands of others scattered across the globe, remnants of civilizations that flourished and faded before recorded history truly began. Textbooks call them relics. Museum plaques label them sites of archaeological interest. But here, among these shadows and stones, lies a story that refuses to stay buried. The official history is simple, almost comfortable. This was a society that rose to greatness, built magnificent cities, ruled for centuries, and eventually succumbed to the natural passage of time, famine, warfare, and slow decay. The narrative fits neatly into our collective understanding of the ancient world. Civilizations rise, civilizations fall, and the modern world continues, detached, unaffected. But that's not the whole truth. Beneath the surface of this accepted history is another version, one whispered about in the back rooms of archives, hinted at in obscure academic papers, and fiercely debated in conferences where the cameras are turned off. A version in which the collapse was not gradual and inevitable, but sudden, violent, and eerily similar to the crises our modern world faces today. We pass over a ridge, the camera dipping lower now, revealing a causeway lined with toppled statues. Their faces have been weathered into anonymity by centuries of wind and rain, but the craftsmanship still speaks of precision and pride. Some lie in pieces, as if deliberately destroyed. Others lean precariously, as though caught mid-fall. The image is haunting, a frozen moment of destruction. The soundtrack shifts. A low, steady drumbeat joins a whisper of strings. The tone is no longer purely archaeological. It's cinematic, urgent, like the opening chapter of a thriller. Cut to a close-up of a weathered tablet, half buried in the soil. Its symbols are unlike anything in mainstream textbooks. Experts will tell you they are ceremonial markings, perhaps the record of a ruler's reign, or the depiction of a religious festival. Yet, to those who have studied them more closely, they appear to be instructions, warnings, written for an audience that might never come. It is here, in the silence between the accepted narrative and the unsettling evidence, that our story begins. Imagine standing in the middle of this abandoned plaza. The air is still, yet you can almost hear the echo of footsteps, the clang of metal tools, the murmur of voices speaking a language no one alive understands. It is an unsettling feeling, as though you are not looking into the past, but into a mirror, because what happened here could happen again. As the prologue unfolds, the camera pulls back once more, revealing the scale of the ruins. Not just a single temple or city, but an entire metropolitan complex sprawling across miles of terrain, residential districts, ceremonial plazas, marketplaces, and irrigation canals. Every stone is placed with deliberate engineering, every street aligned with astronomical precision. This was not the work of a primitive culture experimenting with architecture. This was a civilization that understood mathematics, engineering, and logistics at a level some modern cities still struggle to match. And yet, it's gone. The contrast is jarring. The very qualities that should have ensured their endurance seem to have hastened their destruction. The water channels that once nourished fields now lie dry and clogged with sediment. The broad avenues that once brought merchants and wealth from faraway lands are overgrown with weeds. The walls, built to protect its people from invasion, now crumble quietly into dust. This is where the historian's unease begins, because if a society with this much sophistication, wealth, and planning could vanish almost overnight, what does that mean for us? In this opening section, we are not simply presenting ruins as picturesque backdrops for historical speculation. We are framing them as a warning, a visual message carved in stone, and preserved through time for whoever would come after. The prologue doesn't answer questions, it raises them. How did a civilization this advanced collapse so completely? Why do official records avoid certain inconvenient facts? And why do some historians, even today, seem reluctant to explore the most troubling theories? Our journey will move from this windswept plain into archives, laboratories, and restricted dig sites. We'll follow the trail of suppressed research, forgotten inscriptions, and newly uncovered evidence that paints a chillingly different picture of this civilization's end. This is not just a story about the past, it's about the forces, both natural and man-made, that can bring even the most powerful societies to their knees. The black screen fades into the warm glow of a museum gallery. Spotlights illuminate ancient artifacts, polished ceramics, ornate jewelry, and fragments of stone reliefs. School children shuffle past in neat lines, while a guide recites the familiar tale. Her voice is confident, rehearsed, and unshaken by doubt. This was one of the most remarkable civilizations of the ancient world, she says. Rising from humble beginnings, it became a beacon of progress, its influence reaching far beyond its borders. This is the textbook version, the neat chronological progression we've been taught for generations. The story begins with a people who settled fertile valleys between great rivers. They tamed the land, building small farming villages that grew into bustling towns. Over centuries, these towns became political centers linked by trade routes stretching across mountains and deserts. Kings and councils emerged, their power legitimized by religion and tradition. Great cities rose from the earth, adorned with temples, palaces, and public plazas. The society expanded through diplomacy, conquest, and cultural prestige, reaching a golden age of stability. It is a story of achievement, ingenuity, and inevitable decline, the rise and fall neatly packaged in the same pattern we see in the histories of Greece, Rome, and countless others. But the problem with this account is that it is too neat. The official history smooths over jagged edges, ignoring contradictions in the archaeological record. It omits events that do not fit the established timeline. It favors inscriptions that glorify rulers, while disregarding those that speak of unrest, famine, or strange celestial events. In the archives of a major university, we meet Dr. Elara Montes, an archaeologist who has spent 2 decades piecing together this civilization's history. On record, she can recite the accepted narrative effortlessly. Off record, she admits it's incomplete. The version we teach, she says, leaning closer as if the walls themselves might be listening, is like a mural with sections painted over. The official brushstrokes are there, but beneath them is another image entirely. Her words set the stage for our journey deeper into the cracks of the story. We return to the museum display, a large map of the civilization's territory at its peak. Official accounts portray it as a unified empire, centrally governed with remarkable efficiency, yet trade records suggest that certain provinces resisted control, withholding goods or minting their own coinage in defiance of the capital. The mainstream narrative celebrates their technological marvels, irrigation systems, paved roads, and astronomical observatories. But buried reports from early excavations reveal abrupt halts in construction, as if large projects were suddenly abandoned mid-build. In the official story, such interruptions are explained away as changes in royal priorities. In the hidden story, they may signal deeper crises, economic collapse, mass migration, or internal sabotage. We are shown a series of stone tablets, their carved symbols painstakingly translated in the last century. The published versions are poetic praises of kings and gods, but newer translations, kept out of public circulation, include lines describing the hunger that swept the land and the sickness that dimmed the eyes of our children. These phrases disrupt the Golden Age imagery the official story insists upon. Here's where the contrast sharpens. The known history, a thriving civilization that followed the arc of human progress from primitive beginnings to organized statehood to inevitable decline. The hidden truth, a society whose decline may not have been inevitable at all, but rather triggered by specific catastrophic events that left survivors scrambling to rewrite history into something less frightening. Dr. Montes walks us into a restricted section of the archives where early excavation journals are stored. The handwriting is faded, the paper brittle, but the words still carry urgency. We found something that does not fit, one entry reads. The artifacts from this layer predate the known founding of the city by at least 3 centuries. This detail alone undermines the official origin date taught in classrooms. Why would such a discovery be set aside? Because history, especially ancient history, is often a negotiation between evidence and narrative. And narratives, once established, are fiercely protected, not always for reasons of truth, but for reasons of cultural pride, political interest, or simple institutional inertia. As the camera pans across rows of labeled boxes, each containing fragments of pottery, tools, and inscriptions, the narrator's voice cuts through. What we call history is often only the version that survived, the story that those in power wanted remembered. But every ruin, every inscription, every buried layer tells its own tale, and sometimes, those tales do not agree. We cut to reenactments, actors dressed in finely woven tunics, bustling through market streets, trading goods, debating in open plazas. It is the vibrant, living civilization the official story celebrates. Merchants shout prices, children chase each other between stalls, priests bless offerings to the gods. The air is alive with music and the smell of spices. Then in the same sequence, subtle distortions begin. A stall stands empty, a guard looks nervous, clouds gather overhead, dark and heavy. The music fades to a low, tense hum. It is the same city, but something unseen is beginning to erode its stability. The official story never shows us this moment. It skips from golden age to collapse without exploring the long shadow in between. Back in the present, the museum guide concludes her tour with the same confident flourish she began with. This civilization's legacy lives on in the art, architecture, and ideas they left behind. Their fall remains a mystery, but their achievements are undeniable. Her words are technically true, but they are not the whole truth. The audience is left with a sense of unease. If the official story is incomplete, perhaps even deliberately incomplete, then we must ask what has been left out and why. In the next section, we will see how a single discovery, a sealed archive hidden beneath centuries of earth, would shatter the polished simplicity of the official narrative and force historians to confront the possibility that this civilization's collapse was neither gradual nor inevitable, and that its warnings were meant for us. The black screen lifts into a shot of a desert horizon at dawn. The air is still cool, but the faint shimmer of heat already ripples across the sand. In the distance, tiny figures move slowly, a team of archaeologists, their footsteps crunching over loose stone, their tools strapped to their backs. For decades, this region was considered fully surveyed. Excavations had mapped and cataloged its major ruins, and most academics believed there was nothing significant left to find. But in 2015, a ground-penetrating radar survey intended only to confirm previous maps returned an anomaly. Beneath a stretch of unremarkable earth lay something large, rectangular, and perfectly aligned to the cardinal points. It was too deep to be a foundation, too precisely shaped to be natural. At first, the team thought it might be a collapsed section of the city's old water system. But the radar images showed walls far thicker than any aqueduct and a chamber sealed in such a way that no natural seepage had entered for centuries. The excavation began quietly, without press coverage, in order to prevent looters. Over weeks, the dig site revealed the top edge of a stone doorway buried more than 20 feet below the surface. The entrance was framed by massive blocks, each weighing several tons. What caught the team's attention, however, were the carvings, deep, precise grooves forming a pattern that did not match the known iconography of the civilization. They were not depictions of gods, animals, or rulers. Instead, they appeared to be geometric codes, repeating sequences of triangles, spirals, and intersecting lines. Local oral traditions had long spoken of the chamber that speaks to the future. For generations, these stories were dismissed as myths, legends meant to entertain children or explain strange topographical features. Now the possibility that such a chamber actually existed could no longer be ignored. When the doorway was finally cleared, the lead archaeologist, Dr. Rami al-Hakim, stood in silence for nearly a minute before allowing anyone to approach. The stone threshold bore an inscription in the old script. The officially released translation read simply, "To be opened only in the time of great danger." What lay beyond would ignite one of the fiercest academic controversies of the century. Inside, the chamber was remarkably preserved. The air was dry, the temperature steady, the floor littered only with a fine layer of dust. Along the walls stood rows of sealed clay jars, their lids bound with resin. In the center, atop a raised stone platform, rested a set of flat stone tablets unlike any ever found in the region. Not ceremonial, not decorative, but informational. The markings were dense and systematic, as though arranged in a deliberate sequence meant to be read and understood. The official report to the press described these as archival storage of religious and administrative materials. But leaked photographs told a different story. Some of the tablets contained detailed astronomical observations, not just of the night sky in their era, but projections forward, mapping cycles of drought, flooding, and even seismic activity centuries into the future. Most shocking were the final few tablets. They contained records of the civilization's last decades, written in urgent, almost frantic strokes. These described crop failures, political purges, and most cryptically, the darkening of the sun and the trembling of the earth. This language was dismissed by the official committee as metaphorical, part of the culture's religious allegory. But an independent group of scientists, given access to high-resolution scans, saw a chilling possibility. The words might refer to actual environmental events, possibly volcanic eruptions or meteorological shifts that had devastated the region. The press never saw those translations. Back at the dig site, the team uncovered another startling find. Beneath the platform, hidden in a carved recess, was a small sealed copper cylinder. Inside were thin sheets of beaten gold, etched with the same geometric codes found on the doorway. When digitally enhanced, the patterns appeared to be more than decorative. They resembled schematic diagrams, possibly instructions for a device or method of measurement long forgotten. It was this cylinder, more than the tablets, that caused the sudden shutdown of the dig. The official reason was structural instability of the chamber. Unofficially, rumors swirled that government officials had stepped in, seizing certain artifacts and ordering silence. Dr. al-Hakim disappeared from public view for nearly a year after the find. When he re-emerged at a conference, his presentation was conspicuously free of any mention of the sealed chamber. In a rare interview, when pressed, he only said, "Some discoveries, they change more than we're prepared for." The chamber's existence was eventually acknowledged in a brief academic publication, a sanitized version, with no photographs, only artists' renderings. According to the official record, the chamber contained ceremonial offerings and a handful of routine economic ledgers. No mention was made of warnings, environmental predictions, or coded diagrams. But in the years since, a trickle of leaked images, translated fragments, and whispered accounts from junior researchers have told a very different tale, one in which this civilization did not passively fade into history, but rather fought desperately against an approaching catastrophe they could measure, predict, and even attempt to communicate to the future. And this is the point where the historian's fear takes root. Because if those warnings were meant for us, then they must have believed that what happened to them could happen again. The section closes with a final lingering shot of the sealed doorway, the carved geometric codes catching the last light of the day. The wind rises, kicking dust across the threshold. The screen fades to black, and the narrator's voice cuts in. Some ruins tell us what once was, others tell us what may be again. Up next, we leave the hidden chamber behind and step into the thriving heart of their world as it once was, a city built with the belief it could last forever, and the mystery of why it didn't. The screen bursts into light, not the dim glow of a sealed chamber, but the blinding sun reflecting off polished stone. The camera soars above a vast city as it once was, brought to life through meticulous CGI reconstruction. Streets stretch in perfect grids, towers rise like stone sentinels over bustling plazas. This was the crown jewel of the civilization, a city designed to defy time. Its planners were master builders, blending artistic vision with precise engineering. Every road aligned with astronomical points. Every canal was part of an interlocking water system that kept crops fertile and fountains flowing, even during dry seasons. The official history praises this as their greatest achievement, a triumph of human ingenuity, the unspoken assumption, a city this advanced could not simply fail. From the street level, the detail is breathtaking. Covered walkways shield citizens from the sun. Drainage systems channel rainwater into underground cisterns, ensuring every drop is stored for future use. The markets teem with goods, spices from distant valleys, dyed fabrics, carved ivory and copper tools, whose craftsmanship rivals anything produced in the modern age without industrial machinery. The palaces are built not just for beauty, but for permanence. Massive foundations of interlocking stone absorb seismic tremors. Ventilation shafts pull cool air into rooms, creating natural climate control centuries before electricity. The temples stand on raised platforms, their columns thick enough to withstand both wind and flood. Everything about the city whispers permanence. Yet beneath that whisper is another voice, one that says, they believed they were untouchable. We meet architectural historian Leandro Cruz, standing beside the remains of one of the city's great plazas. You have to understand, he says, brushing his hand over the base of a toppled column, they built for the ages. They thought they had defeated nature. They didn't realize nature had the patience to wait. The contrast between their intentions and their fate is staggering. We pan over the city's walls, formidable barriers of stone, reinforced with timber and covered in plaster. They were meant to keep out enemies, but their height also created wind tunnels that trapped smoke and heat in the streets. Over time, these microclimate effects may have damaged the health of the city's population. The great canals, once their lifeblood, were so intricately linked that when one segment was compromised, whether by flood, silt, or sabotage, entire districts could lose access to water overnight. A marvel of engineering, but also a single point of failure. Inside the temples, murals depict scenes of prosperity, rulers blessing abundant harvests, people feasting, trade ships arriving at the docks. Nowhere do the official images show famine, unrest, or decay. But deep in the lower levels, in rooms rarely open to the public, archaeologists have found a different kind of imagery, hastily painted scenes of fire, bodies, and people fleeing under darkened skies. Cruz leads us to the city's central reservoir. Today it's nothing but a dry depression filled with scrub grass, but in its prime it was a glittering pool fed by aqueducts stretching for miles. The stonework here is as precise as any cathedral, he says, but when the water stopped coming, all of this became useless within weeks. We cut to a reenactment, the city during a sweltering summer. The markets are still open, but food prices are climbing. Water sellers are charging triple. The once orderly plazas are growing tense with arguments. A child pulls at her mother's sleeve, holding an empty jug. The city had no plan for scarcity because its leaders believed scarcity could never return. This overconfidence is echoed in the design of their granaries. Built for capacity, they could store enough grain to feed the city for years, but they relied on an unbroken supply chain from rural farms. When drought or political disruption severed that link, the reserves were depleted faster than anyone thought possible. Even the city's political center, a grand hall supported by massive columns, was both a marvel and a vulnerability. Its centralized administration meant decisions could be enacted swiftly, but it also meant a single coup or assassination could paralyze governance. The irony is that the city's brilliance may have been the very thing that made it fragile. We see this in the city's outer districts, where experimental architecture pushed the limits of what stone and wood could bear. Some buildings rose higher than safety allowed, their foundations cracking under the strain within decades. Others depended on imported materials. When those trade routes faltered, repairs became impossible. Through the lens of modern urban planning, this city's story is a warning. Complexity increases resilience only when it's paired with adaptability. This city was complex but rigid. We cut to a stark transition. The CGI fades into the present-day ruins. The wide boulevards are now narrow paths, choked with weeds. The reservoir is cracked and dry. The market plaza is a field of rubble. Cruz's voice returns. When you build for eternity, you forget that eternity belongs to the earth, not to us. The official history still calls this city one of humanity's greatest achievements, and it was. But the hidden truth is that it was also a perfect case study in systemic vulnerability. Every safeguard had a breaking point, every strength concealed a weakness, and every weakness was eventually exposed. The section closes with a long, slow dolly shot down what was once the city's grand avenue. The walls lean inward like exhausted shoulders. The wind carries dust through the arches, and somewhere in the distance, the faintest echo of running water. Not from the canals, but from rain draining off the hills, bypassing the city entirely. The narrator's voice, low and deliberate, they thought they had built forever. Forever lasted 3 centuries. In the next section we'll widen the lens, because while this city was the civilization's crown jewel, it was also just one node in a vast and interconnected web, a network whose strengths, like the city's, would become the seeds of its collapse. From the air, the ancient landscape unfolds like a living map. Faint lines, the ghostly remains of trade roads, stretch across plains, climb mountains, and vanish into river valleys. Along these arteries, once flowed the lifeblood of an empire. In the official history, this network is celebrated as the ultimate achievement of the civilization, a web of prosperity linking fertile farmlands, mineral-rich mountains, and coastal ports into a single thriving economy. Grain from the interior fed port cities. Copper from the mountains was traded for exotic woods, salt, textiles, and spices, moving in a constant, predictable rhythm. The image is one of stability and abundance, but the hidden truth is that this network was not just a source of strength, it was a dangerous dependency. We begin in the reconstructed harbor of a coastal city. Ships with high, curved prows unload cargo, while merchants tally goods on wax tablets. Fishermen mend nets beside piles of amphorae, their contents destined for markets hundreds of miles inland. The bustle is constant, the sense of interconnection palpable. Dr. Lian Cho, an economic archaeologist, walks us through the remains of one such harbor in the present day. She kneels beside a fragment of pottery, stamped with a seal from a city over 500 miles away. This tells us how deeply connected they were, she says, but also how vulnerable, because if this connection breaks, the entire system feels the shock. In their golden age, the civilization's leaders saw these routes as a form of security. If one region faced a poor harvest, another could supply the deficit. If war threatened, one trade corridor could carry the goods. On paper, it was resilience. Yet history, and modern economics, teaches a harsher lesson. Interdependence magnifies risk. When a key hub fails, the disruption ripples outward, destabilizing every point in the network. Evidence suggests that this is exactly what happened. We move inland along a caravan route that once carried metal ingots from the mountains to the capital. The official record describes these roads as always bustling, always reliable. But archaeological surveys show sudden periods of abandonment. intervals where trade goods all but disappeared from the archaeological layers. The causes are still debated: political unrest, environmental disasters, perhaps both. Whatever the trigger, the effect was devastating. Without regular shipments of copper and tin, the capital's workshops ground to a halt. Without tools and weapons, agricultural production fell. Without food surpluses, merchants in coastal cities could no longer offer valuable exports in return for imports. The entire web began to fray. We cut to a dramatized council meeting in the capital. Messengers arrive breathless, bearing reports: flooding in the southern provinces, armed raids along the western road, rumors of famine in the highlands. The councillors argue, some urging to tighten control over trade, others to relax restrictions and let local regions fend for themselves. The scene is tense, chaotic, and laced with the bitter realization that no decision will please all corners of the realm. One councillor slams a fist on the table: if one city starves, we all starve. It was not just goods that flowed through this network, it was also disease. Analysis of human remains from multiple sites shows spikes in mortality coinciding with periods of heavy trade. Pathogens carried in by merchants and sailors may have spread faster because of the very connectivity that fueled their prosperity. The irony is sharp: the same roads and ports that brought wealth also carried the seeds of collapse. Even culturally, this network created vulnerabilities. Regional identities began to fade under the weight of centralized control. Local traditions were replaced by imperial norms, making provinces less self-reliant. When the central system faltered, communities found themselves without the old practices that might have helped them survive in isolation. Dr. Cho sums it up as we stand beside the skeletal remains of a collapsed market hall. They built a world where everyone depended on everyone else, but no one knew how to stand alone anymore. The story of the web of prosperity is not unique to this civilization. We've seen echoes of it in Rome's dependence on grain, from Egypt, in the Silk Road's vulnerability to political disruption, and in modern supply chains stretching across continents. The danger lies in the assumption that, because the network works today, it will work forever. In the case of this civilization, the collapse of the web was not instantaneous. It began with subtle delays in shipments, small shortages in certain markets, rising prices that most could still afford. Then came the tipping point, perhaps a year when multiple trade corridors failed at once, leaving the capital and its dependent cities scrambling. The official narrative frames the decline as a slow fade, a gradual loss of wealth and influence. But the archaeological record suggests something sharper: a sudden drop in imported goods, a simultaneous abandonment of markets in multiple cities, and evidence of hoarding, a classic sign of panic in an economy under severe stress. In the final minutes of this section, we cut between then and now, bustling trade scenes fading into silent ruins, merchants' cries replaced by the sound of wind, the orderly grid of trade roads now nothing but faint scars on the earth. The narrator's voice settles in: their prosperity was real, and it was their undoing. In binding themselves together so tightly, they lost the ability to survive apart, and when the web tore, it took them all with it. In the next section, we turn from the grand civilization-wide economy to the intimate scale of human record, the letters, decrees, and court logs that captured the tremors of crisis long before the walls began to fall. The great cities are gone, their markets silent, their trade roads swallowed by time. Yet, in the darkness of the ruins, fragments remain, not of stone, but of words. The civilization we are uncovering was literate. Its officials kept ledgers of grain, tallies of tribute, rosters of soldiers, decrees carved into stone for the public to see. Most of these were meant to record triumphs, victories, abundance, stability. But a closer look reveals that even in the years of apparent prosperity, the ink was already running with anxiety. We open on a dimly lit archive chamber in the present day, where a conservator slowly unrolls a brittle scroll. The camera lingers on lines of faded script, each symbol painstakingly inked centuries ago. These are official messages sent between regional governors and the capital, terse, formulaic, but beneath the surface pulsing with unease. One letter reads, "The grain stores are sufficient for this season, but the southern fields have again failed to yield." Another, carved into a public stele, boasts of the completion of a new road, but in a smaller, almost hidden line at the bottom, warns travelers of unrest in the borderlands. Official history has long downplayed these subtle warnings, framing them as isolated incidents, mere footnotes in the reign of great kings. The hidden truth is that these were tremors, the first signs of the earthquake to come. We travel to a windswept plain, where a half-buried slab of stone stands alone. Archaeologist Rana Qureshi brushes away dirt to reveal a proclamation from the royal court, ordering merchants to return to regulated trade routes after unsanctioned markets had begun to appear. Qureshi explains, "This is a sign of central control slipping. When black markets emerge, it means official channels aren't meeting the needs of the people." From there we dive into court records, disputes over land boundaries, complaints of missing goods, petitions for tax relief. Each document is a small voice from the past, but together they form a chorus of growing discontent. The handwriting changes from elegant and measured to rushed and crude, as if the scribes themselves were under strain. One particularly haunting set of tablets records a series of trials for theft. In earlier years, sentences were light, a fine, a return of stolen goods. But as time went on, punishments became harsher. Public lashings, exile, even execution. The law was growing desperate. We cut to a reenactment, a crowded court hall, the air heavy with tension. A merchant kneels before a judge, accused of hoarding grain. Behind him, murmurs ripple through the crowd. The judge, stone-faced, pronounces the sentence, not because the crime is greater than before, but because the shortages have made mercy a luxury the court can no longer afford. The records also hint at political fractures. In 1 year, 3 separate governors issue decrees with subtly conflicting language, as if vying for independent authority. Correspondence from the capital begins to repeat itself, issuing the same orders multiple times, a sure sign that compliance was no longer guaranteed. Yet, for all these warnings, the official annals of the kings remain triumphant. Monument inscriptions from this same period celebrate vast building projects and military parades, their tone almost defiant in the face of growing instability. This contrast, between the glowing public image and the private records of unrest, tells us that the leaders understood the danger, but chose to mask it from their people. In the dim light of the archive, Dr. Qureshi sets down a clay tablet and says softly, "They were writing their own obituary without realizing it." We follow the trail deeper. Beyond the official records, archaeologists have found personal letters, scraps of papyrus and parchment preserved in dry desert caches or sealed within collapsed buildings. Here, the tone is raw, unfiltered. A soldier writes to his wife that his pay is late and the barracks are emptying. A mother warns her sister in another city not to travel the southern road because men vanish there now. One heartbreaking fragment reads simply, "We are told the ships will come. They do not come." The shadows in the records are not just about material shortages or political tension. They reveal a change in psychology. People began to expect failure. The certainty of the golden age was giving way to doubt, and when a society loses faith in its own stability, collapse accelerates. To understand this shift, we overlay the timeline of these records with other evidence. Climate data showing years of drought, trade data showing shrinking volumes of goods, skeletal remains showing signs of malnutrition. The patterns align too closely to be coincidence. We return to the court hall reenactment one last time. This time, the chamber is half empty. The once proud banners are faded. The judge now presides over cases of rebellion, not just theft. Outside, the streets are tense and quiet, the markets thinly stocked. The narrator's voice deepens. History is not just written by the victors, it is also written by the desperate. These records are not relics of governance. They are the fingerprints of a civilization grasping at control while it slipped through their hands. The section closes on a lingering shot of a cracked clay tablet, its script broken by a deep fracture, as if the words themselves could no longer hold together. In the next section, we leave the realm of paper and stone to walk through the physical spaces where the unraveling became impossible to hide, the abandoned quarters, unfinished monuments, and ghostly streets that marked the civilization's final decades. The records told us what was happening. The streets tell us how it felt. We begin in the early morning light, drifting slowly through the wide boulevards of an ancient capital. The camera glides between rows of buildings, their facades still standing, but their windows hollow. Dust stirs in the wind. A solitary bird lands on a broken step, the only living thing in sight. Archaeologists call this phenomenon silent abandonment. It's when a settlement is not destroyed by fire or conquest, but simply walked away from. There are no piles of bodies, no signs of a desperate last stand. Instead, possessions remain in place, as if their owners meant to return but never did. We move to a narrow alley, where pottery jars still line the shelves of a shop. The lids are sealed with hardened wax, the contents untouched. In another building, a loom stands half-warped with thread, the final weaving interrupted mid-pattern. These are not artifacts of conquest, they are the frozen gestures of a life that was suddenly paused. The official histories once claimed these cities were abandoned for strategic consolidation, a planned migration to stronger centers. But excavation tells a different story. The exodus was uneven, chaotic, and driven by necessity, not policy. Some districts were vacated decades before others. The richer quarters held out longer, but eventually, they too were left to the wind. We cut to a drone shot over a satellite survey map. Archaeologist Dr. Luis Martinez points to the pattern. Here, the central plazas were maintained until the very end, but the outer neighborhoods collapsed inward. You can actually see the shrinkage, like a city curling in on itself. And then the most haunting evidence, unfinished works. In one plaza, the foundation of a grand temple lies bare, its stones neatly stacked nearby but never laid. The cornerstone inscription, meant to glorify the king, stops mid-sentence. In another quarter, a massive road, wide enough for 6 carts abreast, stretches straight into the countryside and ends abruptly in a field, as if the workers simply put down their tools one day and never returned. This was a civilization that prided itself on continuity, on monuments that would outlast generations. The fact that they left projects incomplete is more than an architectural detail, it is a psychological one. Something broke their confidence in the future. In reenactment, we see masons at work on the temple site. The foreman glances at the horizon, where a dust storm swells. A messenger arrives and whispers something urgent. Without discussion, the workers begin to gather their tools. Hours later, the plaza is empty, the scaffolding swaying in the wind. But perhaps the most unsettling feature of these empty streets is not their silence, but their order. Unlike the aftermath of war, there is little rubble. Doors are closed, jars sealed, fires extinguished. It's as if people believed they might return, or perhaps that leaving quietly was safer than leaving in chaos. We find similar scenes in port cities. Once bustling harbor, their docks weathered but intact, are littered with mooring stones still tied with ancient rope. A single half-burned ship rests on the sand, never launched. Barnacles climb its hull, the tide lapping gently where trade goods once flowed in. Dr. Martinez explains, when a city falls to siege or fire, you can read the violence in its bones. But here, the bones are peaceful. That's what makes it eerie. Peaceful abandonment often means the danger was not outside the walls, it was inside the system. We move into a once grand market square. Stalls stand empty, but the stone counters remain polished by centuries of hands. The faint grooves in the paving stones mark the paths of carts that rolled here daily. Now weeds grow in those grooves, the pattern of commerce erased by time. Then, in a jarring contrast, we cut to the modern day, a contemporary city undergoing evacuation. Footage shows shop windows covered in dust, streets eerily still. The voiceover ties the parallel: when people lose faith in their leaders, their safety, or the promise of tomorrow, the streets empty before the records admit it. In the final minutes, we walk with the camera through a residential district. A child's toy lies in the dirt, a small carved animal, its paint faded but intact. A clay lamp sits on a threshold, its wick charred from its last use. These tiny details make the collapse human. The past stops feeling distant. The narrator's voice is almost a whisper. Civilizations do not fall in a single night. They fade house by house, street by street, until the last footsteps echo into silence. The section ends with the camera pulling upward over the city, revealing the skeletal grid of its streets under the shifting sand. From here, we will leave the abandoned urban centers and turn to the human stories that survived beyond their walls, the refugees, the wanderers, the communities that carried fragments of the old world into a new, harsher reality. From the moment the first neighborhoods were abandoned, a slow migration began, a movement not recorded in royal chronicles, but etched into the land itself. They were farmers and craftsmen, scribes and merchants, women carrying infants, elders leaning on staffs. They didn't march in neat columns. They drifted in family groups, in caravans, in desperate clusters, clinging to whatever possessions could be carried on a back or loaded onto a cart. The records that survive speak only of population redistribution. It sounds orderly, almost bureaucratic, as if this were a calculated, peaceful resettlement. But the archaeology paints a different picture: trails worn through wilderness where no roads had been before, hastily dug shelters on the margins of riverbanks, and the remains of campfires scattered far from any known settlement. We begin this section on a barren plain at dusk. The wind lifts the dust from a series of faint depressions in the soil. Drone imagery reveals they form a line stretching toward the horizon. These are not roads. They are the traces of a migration route, preserved only because no one ever returned to walk over them again. Reenactment takes us to the moment of departure. A mother folds a wool blanket, placing it in a basket alongside dried grain. A young boy struggles to carry a clay jar of water. The father lashes a few wooden beams together, forming a crude sledge to drag behind him. In the distance, the outline of their city walls fades in the evening haze. Some groups headed for fertile valleys, seeking land untouched by the crisis. Others followed the coastlines, relying on fishing to survive. A few turned inward, into forested highlands, living off wild game and berries. Survival dictated direction. In one mountain pass, archaeologists found a cluster of graves dating to the same decade as the city's abandonment. The bodies were buried with care, but with almost no goods, just simple woven mats and one small necklace carved from bone. These people had fled with so little that even their dead were sent into the afterlife with nothing but memory. Dr. Amara Qureshi, a migration historian, explains, when populations disperse under stress, you get cultural fragmentation. People carry pieces of their identity, language, rituals, tools, but they adapt them to their new reality. Within 2 generations, the descendants barely recognize the old world, and yet fragments persisted. In a windswept coastal settlement hundreds of miles from the original cities, researchers found pottery bearing the same geometric motifs as those in the abandoned markets. In a highland village, songs were recorded that contained verses, long since stripped of their meaning, that matched inscriptions in the old capital's temple. These were cultural seeds, scattered on harsh soil, taking root in unexpected places. The journey itself was often deadly. Crossing river deltas meant losing carts to mud, Traversing deserts meant rationing water to the point of collapse. Food shortages forced hard choices: abandon the old, leave behind the sick. Some camps became temporary villages, never meant to last but inhabited for decades, as the people found themselves trapped between hostile terrain and hostile neighbors. One excavation in such a camp revealed layers of occupation, the earliest with imported goods from the old cities, the later with only local materials. It was a slow forgetting, each generation further removed from the urban world their ancestors had known. Reenactment here is raw. We see a caravan stopping at night, lighting a small guarded fire. A child clutches a figurine, the last relic of a vanished home. A man kneels to sharpen a stone blade, the metal tools of his ancestors long traded or lost. In the morning, they rise and move on. The hidden truth is that these wanderers were not just survivors. They were carriers of civilization. Though they lacked monuments, their memories, skills, and myths formed the blueprint for the cultures that would later emerge. We cut to modern anthropologists tracing linguistic threads backward, finding words for market, wall, and water temple embedded in remote dialects that had no markets, no walls, and no temples for centuries. These are the ghost words of the old world, lingering in speech like ruins in the jungle. But not all wanderers were peaceful. In times of scarcity, some became raiders, targeting settled communities they encountered. These raids were recorded in the chronicles of neighboring peoples, often describing them as starving wolves or shadow tribes. It is likely that in the chaos, former citizens of the same civilization fought each other for resources. The unity of the old cities dissolved into shifting alliances and rivalries. The narrator's voice deepens. A city can die quickly. A people die slowly, and in the long twilight, they are never just victims. They are predators, traders, refugees, settlers. They shape the world, even as they lose their own. We then step forward in time, showing how some wandering groups settled in fertile regions and built smaller, more defensible communities. Without the scale or ambition of their ancestors, these new towns were pragmatic, their walls low, their homes modest, their ceremonies simplified. But in their pottery, their burial customs, and their oral histories, we see faint reflections of the lost civilization. One highland village still builds its houses with a curious alignment, the doorway facing a particular point on the horizon, the same orientation as the great gates of the abandoned capital. No one alive can explain why. It is a ritual without a remembered reason, an inherited gesture stripped of context. This section ends with an aerial shot, a caravan winding through a narrow canyon, the camera pulling back until the travelers are mere specks, dwarfed by the cliffs. The narrator closes, the stones of the city will crumble, but the feet of its people will leave trails across the earth. And in those trails, the echo of a world that once believed it would last forever. Next, we will follow not the people who left, but those who stayed behind, hiding among the ruins. Some stayed, not out of hope, but out of something harder to name. The chronicles are silent on their reasons. Perhaps they were too old to make the journey. Perhaps they feared the unknown more than the dying city. Or perhaps the city itself, even in ruin, was their anchor. The streets they knew better than their own bodies, the walls that had once promised safety. To them, leaving would have been a kind of death all its own. We open in dim morning light. Vines crawl across a cracked plaza. A single figure walks between toppled columns, carrying a bundle of firewood. She pauses to glance toward the empty market stalls, where the wind rattles loose cloth. In her eyes, we see both defiance and resignation. Archaeologists call them terminal occupants. These were the final generation of residents, clinging to life amid decay. Their homes were patched with scavenged materials. Public fountains, no longer fed by aqueducts, became dry pits. Rainwater was collected in jars. Temple bells, once ringing in unison, fell silent, except when the wind struck a broken bronze chime, producing a haunting, uneven tone. The known history tells us the cities were abandoned in stages, each wave of departure leaving fewer and fewer people behind. But the hidden truth is that some neighborhoods never emptied completely. Excavations have found late-period trash pits containing a mix of old luxury goods and crude survival tools, a gold clasp buried alongside a sharpened bone dagger. Dr. Leandro Falcone, an urban collapse specialist, notes, the people who stayed became scavengers in their own streets. They stripped the walls for wood, dug up floor tiles for fuel, and repurposed sacred spaces for storage or shelter. What was once taboo became necessity. We follow a dramatized sequence. A man lowers a bucket into a well, pulling up muddy water. He drinks cautiously, grimacing at the taste. Later he moves through an abandoned palace, prying bronze hinges from a door, not for art, but to melt into tools. The grand audience chamber, once a theater of politics, is now a workshop, littered with animal bones and fishing nets. There is an unsettling beauty in this stage of the city's life. With its population reduced to a handful, nature began to reclaim the streets. Moss spread across rooftops, birds nested in the eaves of temples. Goats wandered the courtyards. The city became both home and wilderness, a place where the built world and the natural world coexisted in uneasy balance. But it was also dangerous. Without guards, the walls offered no real defense. Wild animals roamed freely at night. Raiders occasionally appeared, searching for valuables left behind. Sometimes, the last inhabitants fled into hiding, watching strangers strip their world before moving on. In one district, archaeologists discovered what they believed to be a hidden refuge, a cellar accessed through a trapdoor beneath a floor of tightly packed clay. Inside were storage jars, sleeping mats, and a small altar, evidence that a family may have lived entirely underground for weeks or months at a time. The emotional weight of staying behind is almost impossible to reconstruct. Imagine the silence, no merchants calling in the market, no festival drums, no sound of children playing in the streets. Only wind, the drip of rain, and the occasional creak of collapsing timber. The city would have felt like a mausoleum, yet still pulsed faintly with human presence. The last residents were also the last witnesses. They saw the temples crumble, the statues tilt, the gardens wither. In their memories, the city was still alive, but outside their doors, the bones of that life were bleaching in the sun. And they adapted in strange ways. Some abandoned the idea of the city entirely, treating it instead as a hunting ground. They moved between districts seasonally, following water sources and small game. Others became caretakers of memory, maintaining shrines long after organized religion had vanished. Offerings were left in cracked bowls, prayers whispered into darkness. One of the most haunting discoveries comes from a collapsed townhouse. Inside, in what had been the family dining room, a complete set of ceramic bowls was found, neatly stacked, unused for decades. It was as if someone had hoped that one day the table would be set again, and so they preserved what they could, waiting for guests who never came. The narrator speaks over images of faded murals. To live in a dying city is to live inside a memory. Every street is a reminder of what has been lost. Every sound is an echo of voices that are gone. Eventually, even these holdouts disappeared. Whether they died in place, were taken by illness, or finally abandoned their posts is unknown. The archaeological record simply stops. The city's story shifts entirely into silence. We close this section with a cinematic pullback. A single light, a cooking fire, flickers in a window of a massive, otherwise dark metropolis. Slowly, the fire dies out. The camera keeps pulling back until the city becomes just a dark shape against the earth, swallowed by night. Next, we will follow what the rest of the world saw when they came upon these ruins, and how their interpretations shaped the first myths of the civilization's fall. When the last ember of human life flickered out in the city, Centuries passed before strangers came upon it again. They were traders, nomads, wanderers, people who had never known the city in its prime, but who felt its presence long before they saw its walls. Travelers' journals describe approaching through silent valleys, the air strangely still, the land scattered with broken stones. One account from an early caravan leader recalls his horses becoming restless, refusing to move forward as the horizon revealed walls without smoke, gates without guards. The known history tells us these explorers were the first to discover the ruins. But the hidden truth is that in many cases they had been here before, not these men themselves, but their ancestors, passing stories of a forbidden place where the gods had punished men, or a city had drowned in dust. They had heard of it in myth long before they walked through its empty streets. We open on a dramatized scene. A small caravan crests a ridge at sunset. Before them sprawls the silent city, bathed in gold and shadow. The wind carries the faint smell of dust and something older, a mineral tang, like dry stone. The men exchange glances. None speak. They descend slowly, as if entering a sacred or dangerous place. Those who recorded their journeys often laced their writing with awe and unease. One merchant wrote of streets wide enough for 10 men to ride abreast, yet empty as a tomb. Another described columns taller than the tallest palms, and faces of stone staring down at him with expressions both stern and sorrowful. At first, the ruins were treated like holy ground. Travelers would remove their shoes before walking through the main gates. Offerings were left in broken temples. A few even claimed to hear whispers in the echo of their footsteps, an auditory illusion caused by the peculiar acoustics of the stone corridor, but one that fed the belief that spirits lingered. It was not long before stories began to spread. In nearby villages, news of the city's reappearance sparked curiosity and fear. Some claimed the ruins were cursed, that any who took a stone or artifact would meet with misfortune. Others saw it as a place of opportunity, a forgotten treasury waiting to be claimed. Archaeological evidence suggests that the first wave of outsiders took surprisingly little. Initial visits left the city mostly intact, with signs of temporary camps along its edges, but no large-scale looting. It was only later, when word reached more distant and ambitious ears, that organized expeditions came with the intent to strip the place of anything valuable. But before greed took over, there was wonder. Imagine standing before a massive carved doorway, its lintel etched with symbols you cannot read, its surface worn by centuries of wind. Imagine touching the stone and feeling the faint grooves where a mason's hand once worked. In that moment, the gulf of time collapses. You are here. But so were they. The hidden truth is that some early visitors tried to preserve these places. In one uncovered encampment, archaeologists found fragments of parchment containing careful sketches of murals, along with notes comparing the images to known legends. These anonymous chroniclers may have been the first amateur historians of the lost city, working quietly in a world that did not yet understand the value of preservation. Yet even they could not resist the pull of legend. Some began to embellish their accounts, speaking of entire palaces filled with gold, or of sealed chambers that still held sleeping kings. Whether they truly believed these tales, or simply found them useful for attracting patrons, is unknown. What is certain is that such stories gave the ruins a new life, not as a place where people had lived and died, but as a symbol, a stage for whatever story the teller wished to tell. We watch as myths take shape. A nomadic tribe claims the city was swallowed by a sandstorm in a single night, as punishment for arrogance. A traveling priest says it was abandoned because its ruler made war on the gods. A sailor insists he saw the city's reflection in the sea long before reaching land, as if it existed in two places at once. The truth, slow collapse from environmental stress, political fragmentation, or both, is far less sensational, but in a prescientific age. Myth was more powerful than fact, and so the ruins became a mirror for the fears and hopes of those who gazed upon them. The city also gained a strange role as a test of courage. Warriors would dare each other to spend a night inside the walls. Some claimed to wake to the sound of footsteps, others swore they felt a hand brush their shoulder though no one was there. Whether these were hallucinations brought on by fear or something more, they added to the city's growing reputation as a place where the veil between worlds was thin. Not all visitors returned. Records from neighboring regions tell of missing caravans whose last known location was near the ruins. In some cases, the explanation was likely mundane, bandits, illness, or getting lost. But in the imagination of the time, the city itself became a predator, drawing travelers in and keeping them. The narrator's voice softens. In the silence of the ruins, a strange thing happens. The mind begins to fill the void with its own echoes. In the absence of people, the stones themselves become storytellers. Eventually, these first impressions, awe, reverence, fear, would give way to a more deliberate phase of exploration. Kingdoms and empires would send sanctioned expeditions, not to worship the ruins, but to study, map, and exploit them. The myths would evolve again, shifting from divine punishment to historical curiosity. But in these earliest days, the city was still a mystery, untouched by scholarship. Its stories lived in the mouths of traders and wanderers, in fireside tales told under star-filled skies. And in that sense, it was alive again, not in stone and mortar, but in the human imagination. We close with an image of a lone traveler, leaving the city at dawn, glancing back over his shoulder one last time. In the rising light, the ruins seem almost whole again, as if the city were holding its breath, waiting for the next set of eyes to find it. Next, we turn to the moment when those eyes belonged not to wandering traders, but to organized teams sent with one purpose: to uncover, record, and claim the legacy of a civilization thought to be lost forever. By the time the first organized expeditions arrived at the lost city, its aura of mystery had already been carefully cultivated by decades of rumor. These were not passing traders or cautious nomads. These were men sent with orders, and often with funding from powerful patrons who wanted proof of the city's grandeur, artifacts for their collections, or strategic knowledge hidden in its ruins. The known history says these excavations marked the birth of archaeological science in the region. The hidden truth is far messier. This was as much treasure hunting as it was scholarship. The line between curiosity and greed blurred, with spades and chisels digging not only for knowledge, but for marketable relics. Our first scene opens in the sweltering heat of late summer. A column of laborers trudges toward the main gate, their tools clinking against leather satchels. The leader, a foreign-born academic in a wide-brimmed hat, carries a rolled-up map based more on travelers' tales than actual measurements. He is both scientist and salesman, a man who will write to his sponsors with the same breathless enthusiasm whether he finds a golden statue or a broken pot, because either way, it's worth funding. Early excavation methods were crude. Teams cleared rubble by hand or with crude pulleys, prying open sealed doorways without first recording the placement of stones or inscriptions. Some sites were dismantled before their significance could be understood. The goal was not to preserve the city in place, but to extract it, piece by piece, for study and display elsewhere. And yet, amidst the damage, there were moments of discovery that changed the course of history. In one partially collapsed building, workers uncovered a series of clay tablets inscribed with a language no one could yet read. At the time, these were seen as decorative curiosities, their true value only realized decades later when the script was finally deciphered, revealing an account of the city's founding and its first kings. The excavations also exposed traces of ordinary life: grinding stones, cooking pots, children's toys, the objects that rarely make it into grand histories, yet speak more clearly than any royal decree about the people who once lived there. The known history tends to emphasize the monumental, the towering gates, the massive statues, but the hidden truth lies in these fragments of everyday existence. Rivalries quickly emerged between excavation teams. Competing expeditions raced to publish their findings first, sometimes withholding critical information from each other. In one notorious case, a rival group broke into a half-dug chamber at night, removing artifacts before the official team returned in the morning. The theft was never formally acknowledged, but pieces matching the description appeared years later in a private European collection. Funding was always a factor. When a dig turned up nothing of value by the standards of wealthy sponsors, meaning no gold, no spectacular sculptures, the money dried up. This financial pressure led some team leaders to embellish their reports or strategically time the release of discoveries to coincide with requests for renewed funding. The political climate added another layer of complexity. The ruins were often located in contested territory, where local leaders viewed the influx of foreign teams with suspicion. Permissions to dig were negotiated with promises of shared spoils or political favors. In some cases, local workers were paid not just in wages, but in the right to keep whatever minor artifacts they found, fueling an informal trade in antiquities that still echoes today in black market sales. A recurring problem was the lack of conservation. Frescoes faded once exposed to open air, delicate carvings crumbled when touched by ungloved hands, and entire structures collapsed when supporting debris was hastily cleared. One expedition leader later admitted in his journal, "In my eagerness to see the chamber beyond, I may have destroyed the only surviving lintel of its kind." Despite these missteps, the excavations transformed the ruins from a half-forgotten legend into a subject of global fascination. Illustrated reports made their way into newspapers, showing readers halfway across the world images of colossal statues, intricate reliefs, and artifacts that hinted at a civilization far more advanced than previously believed. For the first time, scholars began to see the city not as an isolated wonder, but as part of a broader network, a hub in a web of trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange that spanned continents. The discovery of foreign coins, exotic stones, and imported pottery suggested that this city had once been deeply connected to the wider ancient world. The hidden truth, however, is that these connections made its collapse all the more chilling. A city this well connected should have been resilient. Instead, it vanished. The excavators rarely dwelled on this in their public reports, preferring to focus on the glory of the past rather than the implications of its end. We close this section with a striking image. An excavation team unseals a massive underground hall. Their lantern light dances across a row of seated stone figures, their faces serene, their eyes blank. For a moment, the silence feels heavy, almost watchful. The men step forward, boots echoing in the stillness. Somewhere in the darkness, a pebble falls. The sound is small, but it makes every head turn. From here, the story moves into a new phase, one where the focus shifts from individual expeditions to a global race for artifacts, knowledge, and prestige. What began as isolated digs will soon become a geopolitical contest, with nations using the past as a weapon in the present. The first excavations lit a spark. Soon, that spark roared into a fire that spread far beyond the dusty ruins themselves. What began as scattered academic expeditions quickly evolved into a global race, not merely for knowledge, but for ownership of history. The known history tells this as a golden age of discovery, when museums filled with wonders and nations celebrated the achievements of brave scholars. The hidden truth is that it was also an era of plunder, rivalry, and propaganda. The past became a resource to be extracted just like gold or oil, and nations competed fiercely to claim it as their own. By the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the city's name was no longer just an archaeological curiosity, it was a symbol of prestige. Whoever could say, "We have the finest treasures from the lost city," could stake a claim to cultural superiority. The ruins themselves became a political battlefield, with imperial powers maneuvering for excavation rights, each one wary that their rivals might uncover something that would rewrite history in their favor. We open with an image of steamships unloading crates marked with stenciled museum seals. Inside these crates are not just artifacts, they are trophies of an invisible war. Stone reliefs, ceremonial weapons, carved ivory, each destined for a grand display hall thousands of miles from the desert where they were found. Crowds will marvel at them without ever knowing the political deals, bribes, or outright theft that brought them there. The methods of acquisition varied. Some expeditions worked under official agreements with local authorities, promising a fair division of finds. In practice, this often meant that the most valuable items, both materially and historically, went abroad. Others operated under the guise of emergency salvage operations, claiming that unless artifacts were removed immediately, they would be lost to erosion or looting. Then there were the shadow operations, smugglers disguised as traders, archaeologists who shipped items home in personal luggage to avoid customs, even diplomats whose diplomatic immunity shielded them from inspection, were rumored to have used their privilege to transport rare items out of the country. The stakes were more than academic. In the era of nationalism, the possession of ancient treasures served as tangible proof of a nation's place in the great lineage of civilization. Museums became arenas of soft power, where the grandeur of the past was displayed to bolster the prestige of the present. The Louvre, the British Museum, the Berlin State Museums, all competed to host the most spectacular exhibitions, each claiming to have the definitive collection. This competition drove technological innovation in archaeology. Improved excavation tools, more accurate surveying instruments, and even early photography were deployed to document and extract artifacts more quickly and efficiently. But speed was often the enemy of care. Sites were stripped bare in months that should have taken years to study. Fragile structures collapsed under the weight of hurried excavation. Not all the damage was physical. In their eagerness to interpret the finds in ways that would please sponsors and national audiences, some archaeologists shaped narratives that downplayed or erased the role of local cultures. In public exhibitions, captions often credited the discovery to the expedition leader, while the names and contributions of local workers vanished into anonymity. The city's legacy became fragmented. A ceremonial mask might be in Paris, its matching ceremonial dagger in London, and the temple mural that depicted their use in Berlin. Reconstructing the full picture of the city's culture became nearly impossible because its pieces were scattered across the globe, each jealously guarded by the institution that possessed it. Amid this frenzy, whispers began to circulate of finds too shocking to display, texts that hinted at political corruption at the city's height, reliefs that depicted scenes uncomfortably similar to modern warfare, artifacts that suggested the city fell not to an external enemy, but to internal collapse, famine, unrest, or ecological disaster. These were quietly locked away in archives, sometimes mislabeled to avoid public scrutiny. The most dramatic rivalry unfolded between two major powers whose expeditions reached the site within weeks of each other. For years, their teams worked in adjacent zones, each trying to outdo the other with bigger finds and bolder claims. At one point, a heated dispute over the boundaries of their dig sites nearly escalated into armed conflict. The local governor had to personally intervene, drawing a literal line in the sand to keep the rival crews apart. This was also the period when the first rumors of a forbidden chamber began to spread. Both rival teams claimed to know of a sealed underground complex said to contain the city's most sacred relics. Neither would admit publicly to finding it, but privately both accused the other of secretly accessing it and removing its contents. To this day, the location of the chamber, if it existed at all, remains unknown. The race for the past left behind a paradox. On one hand, it preserved countless artifacts that might otherwise have been lost. On the other, it permanently severed them from their original context, distorting the story they could tell. The city's heritage became a puzzle with too many missing pieces, and some of those pieces may never be returned. We close on a visual contrast. In one part of the world, A grand museum hall bathed in warm light is filled with tourists gazing in awe at a towering stone guardian from the lost city. In another, thousands of miles away, the original site sits silent and windswept, the pedestal where that guardian once stood now empty, its absence as eloquent as any artifact. The next stage of the story will turn from the scramble for artifacts to the breakthrough that finally allowed scholars to read the city's own words that would challenge the sanitized narratives of its past and reveal a collapse that was disturbingly familiar to modern eyes. For centuries, the city's ruins had been silent. Carved symbols stared out from stone walls, etched into ceremonial vessels, and painted across shattered murals, but no one could read them. They were beautiful, intricate, almost hypnotic, yet they remained mute. Without their voice, the city could be admired but not understood. Known history celebrates the eventual deciphering of this script as a triumph of human intellect, a story of patience and genius. The hidden truth is that the breakthrough was born not only from scholarship, but also from a mix of obsession, rivalry, and accidents. And once the words were finally spoken aloud, they did not tell the story anyone expected. The first serious attempt to understand the script came from a linguist who believed it might be related to an already known ancient language. He spent decades comparing symbols, convinced he would find a direct connection. He never did. What he failed to see, and what others later realized, was that the language was a hybrid, a blend of multiple influences, possibly reflecting centuries of trade and cultural mingling. The city had been a crossroads, and its writing carried the fingerprints of many worlds. The breakthrough came almost by chance. In the early 20th century, an excavation uncovered a carved tablet buried deep beneath a collapsed temple floor. On one side were the city's familiar mysterious glyphs, on the other, there was something unexpected, a translation into a known ancient language, one still understood by scholars. This bilingual tablet became the city's Rosetta Stone, but even with this key, the work was not easy. The language's grammar was unlike anything in the translator's repertoire, and many symbols carried meanings that changed depending on their arrangement. There were also silent signs, characters that were not meant to be read aloud, but served as symbolic markers, altering the tone or emotional charge of the text. These nuances hinted at a culture where communication was as much about suggestion and ritual as it was about literal meaning. The first translated texts were practical, tax records, lists of offerings to temples, inventories of stored grain. These offered glimpses into the city's daily life, but revealed little about its larger history. Then came the inscriptions on monumental architecture, dedications, proclamations, and ceremonial hymns. And finally, the historians found what they had been hoping for: chronicles. Written in sweeping, poetic form, these works recorded the reigns of rulers, great battles, monumental constructions, and most tantalizingly, omens and prophecies. At first, the chronicles seemed to match the grand narrative that museums and textbooks had already built, a powerful city-state, led by divine kings, conquering its neighbors and thriving until its mysterious disappearance. But as the translations continued, troubling details emerged. There were repeated mentions of failed harvests. Poems lamented the angry sky and the rivers that no longer remembered the sea. Entire sections spoke of mass migrations from the surrounding countryside into the city, not as a sign of prosperity, but as a desperate flight from collapsing rural economies. Even more unsettling were references to internal unrest. Murals once thought to depict ceremonial dances were reinterpreted as scenes of protest and suppression. Stone carvings of warriors marching through city streets were not military parades, but depictions of soldiers restoring order during food riots. Some texts hinted at deep divisions within the ruling elite. One ruler's inscriptions praised his wisdom and generosity. Another ruler, writing just a generation later, condemned him as a coward who ignored warnings from the priest astronomers. One chilling passage described the Council of Shadows, a group of high officials who met in secret to decide which truths could be spoken and which must be buried. The most dramatic revelation came from a temple inscription that scholars nearly misinterpreted. At first, it was thought to be a hymn praising the city's patron deity. On closer reading, it turned out to be a plea for mercy, not from an invading army, but from the god itself, whom the people believed they had angered through their mismanagement of the land. It described fields turning to dust, wells running dry, and the need to appease the earth with the bodies of the willing. This was no simple religious ritual, it was a description of human sacrifice during the city's final years. The deciphering also shed light on the city's foreign connections. Loanwords from distant cultures hinted at far-reaching trade networks and perhaps even alliances that collapsed in the city's final decades. The sudden absence of these foreign terms in later inscriptions suggested the severing of these ties, leaving the city isolated when it most needed help. What shocked historians most was not that the city collapsed, but how familiar its final years sounded. The records described a society that ignored environmental warnings, doubled down on extravagant public works, even as its resources dwindled, and relied on authoritarian control to suppress dissent rather than address the underlying crises. These were not the exotic failings of an alien culture, they were patterns that modern historians recognized all too well. The more that was translated, the harder it became to fit the city into the neat celebratory narratives that museums had been displaying for decades. Exhibitions that once framed the city as an eternal beacon of human achievement began to include quiet disclaimers about ongoing research and revised interpretations. Some artifacts were quietly removed from display, particularly those whose inscriptions told stories of famine, unrest, and sacrifice. And yet, the deciphering was incomplete. There were still hundreds of glyphs with no clear meaning, some of them appearing only once or twice across all known inscriptions. Were they rare words, sacred names, or coded messages intended only for the initiated? No one knew. Some scholars speculated that the final key to understanding the city's fall might be hidden in those unresolved signs. We close this section with a striking image, two panels, side by side. On the left, the silent stones before the deciphering, their glyphs, nothing more than abstract beauty. On the right, the same stones now alive with meaning, their carved lines whispering stories of ambition, resilience, hubris, and ruin. The city had found its voice, and in that voice was not only a warning from the past, but an echo of the present. The next section will follow the moment when that warning began to feel personal, when climate scientists, economists, and political analysts started to realize that the city's story was not finished, but repeating itself in our own time. When the last pieces of the city's language began to form complete sentences, the reaction among historians was not excitement alone. It was unease. For the first time, the city's decline was not just an abstract cautionary tale, it was a mirror. Known history frames ancient collapses as distant, sealed in time, their mistakes safely contained within the past. The hidden truth is that the patterns leading to those collapses are rarely unique. They are cyclical, and the cycle is turning again. It started quietly. A small group of archaeologists, having spent decades immersed in the city's translated chronicles, began presenting papers at academic conferences. They avoided sensationalism, but their graphs told a stark story. They compared the city's last century of records with modern economic and environmental data. The curves, population spikes, resource depletion rates, political instability indices overlapped with unsettling precision. At first, these parallels were brushed aside as coincidences, artifacts of selective data. You can always find a pattern if you look for it, critics said. But the evidence grew harder to dismiss when climatologists joined the discussion. They pointed to the city's repeated references to angry skies and the sun that burns too long, poetic descriptions that matched known symptoms of prolonged droughts caused by shifting climate cycles. Satellite reconstructions of the region's ancient environment confirmed that the city's agricultural lands had indeed faced a series of severe droughts in its final decades. Modern scientists didn't have to stretch far to see the resemblance. Today's grain-producing regions are already experiencing similar patterns: multi-year droughts, rising temperature, collapsing pollinator populations. The language of the ancient inscriptions began to sound less like myth and more like reportage from a modern newswire. Economists found other parallels. The city's chronicles described extravagant public works in its twilight years: colossal temples, victory monuments, and ceremonial plazas, built even as food stores dwindled. These projects were framed as a way to inspire confidence among the people, but they drained the treasury and increased the strain on the labor force. Modern analysts saw echoes in nations investing heavily in image-driven megaprojects while their economic foundations eroded. The city's trade collapse offered another point of comparison. In earlier centuries, its records celebrated merchants arriving from distant ports, their ships heavy with exotic goods. In the final decades, those references vanished almost entirely. Today's global trade system, while more complex, is just as vulnerable to political disruption, resource scarcity, and environmental crises. The city's isolation was sudden and devastating, a reminder that global interconnection is no guarantee against collapse. But perhaps the most unsettling parallel was political. In the city's final years, inscriptions recorded increasingly authoritarian measures: rationing enforced by armed patrols, public gatherings banned, and dissent punished as treason against the gods. Modern historians, reading these lines, did not need to imagine what such measures looked like. They could see them in headlines from across the contemporary world. A conference in Geneva became the turning point. Here, for the first time, archaeologists, historians, economists, climate scientists, and political analysts came together to present a unified interpretation of the city's fall. The mood in the hall was tense. These were professionals trained to avoid exaggeration, yet the data was blunt. The similarities between the ancient collapse and the early indicators in our own world were not vague, they were measurable. A key slide from that conference showed two timelines running in parallel, one for the ancient city, the other for the modern world. Each marked with events: drought, trade disruption, wealth concentration, civil unrest, leadership instability. The ancient timeline ended abruptly. The modern one had not yet reached that point. The room was silent for several seconds after the slide changed. Media outlets caught wind of the presentations. At first, coverage was cautious, framing it as an interesting academic debate, but some journalists dug deeper, interviewing the scientists directly. The resulting articles were sharper, their headlines less restrained. "Ancient collapse offers blueprint for our future. Are we the next lost city?" Public reaction was mixed. Some dismissed the warnings as alarmist, a dramatic oversimplification of complex modern systems. Others felt a creeping dread, the sense that the ruins were not relics, but a rehearsal. Online forums debated whether humanity had truly evolved past the cycles that destroyed ancient civilizations, or whether technological advancements simply delayed the inevitable. Among the most haunting commentaries was from a veteran archaeologist who had been part of the deciphering team from the start. In a television interview, she leaned forward in her chair and spoke quietly. "We thought we were learning about them. We were wrong. We've been learning about ourselves, the version of us that will exist if we keep making the same choices." The parallels did more than provoke debate. They began to influence policy discussions. At least one government invited members of the research team to present their findings to Parliament. The discussion was less about the archaeological details and more about the lessons, the dangers of ignoring environmental warning signs. The risks of concentrating resources in prestige projects while critical infrastructure decays. The vulnerability of trade-dependent economies when alliances falter. Yet not all leaders welcomed the comparisons. Some saw them as politically inconvenient, framing them as fear-mongering designed to undermine public trust. In certain countries, documentaries exploring the collapse were quietly discouraged, and some research funding for related archaeological projects dried up. Meanwhile, in classrooms, a new generation of students began to study the city's fall, not as an isolated historical curiosity, but as part of a broader pattern of human behavior. Professors used the city as a case study in resilience and fragility, asking students to imagine what measures might have averted the collapse and whether those measures were being applied today. The lesson that emerged was both simple and devastating. Civilizations rarely collapse because of a single cause. It is almost always a convergence: environmental stress, economic imbalance, political rigidity, and the erosion of social trust. The city was undone not by one blow, but by many small fractures that eventually could not be repaired. As we leave this section, the camera lingers on a modern skyline at sunset. In the fading light, the towers are golden, magnificent, but as the shadows lengthen, they begin to resemble the silhouette of the ancient ruins. The resemblance is unintentional, yet undeniable. The next section will dive deeper into the modern response. The scientists, thinkers, and leaders who, after seeing these echoes, began urgently debating whether history's warning could still be heeded, or whether the cycle was already too far along to break. By the time the Geneva Conference's findings had spread beyond academic circles, the question was no longer whether the ancient city's collapse was relevant to us. It was whether we had the courage to confront the possibility that we were walking the same path. Known history tells us that civilizations rise and fall in ways shaped by their own unique circumstances. The hidden truth, increasingly uncomfortable to acknowledge, is that the triggers often rhyme across centuries. The more we studied the city's last days, the more they sounded like the opening chapters of our own. The debate began quietly among experts. Archaeologists and historians, used to carefully measured language, began allowing urgency into their public talks. Economists noted that global debt levels, resource inequality, and supply chain fragility had reached statistical thresholds that eerily mirrored the pre-collapse data from the city's records. Climate scientists pointed to drought, crop failure, and shifting rainfall patterns, not as abstract predictions, but as conditions already unfolding. Soon, the conversation could no longer be contained to academic journals. News programs aired special segments pairing footage of the city's weather-worn ruins with modern megacities glittering under the night sky. Two faces of the same story, one anchor asked. The juxtaposition was unnerving. Public reaction split into camps. One camp, the alarmed, saw the parallels as a wake-up call. They argued for immediate action, restructuring economies to be less dependent on fragile global supply lines, investing heavily in sustainable infrastructure, and rethinking political systems that rewarded short-term gains over long-term stability. The other camp, the dismissive, saw the warnings as exaggerated, arguing that modern technology and global cooperation made a collapse on the same scale impossible. The battle lines weren't just ideological, they were generational. Younger voices, especially those already concerned about climate change and political instability, were quick to accept the comparison. They saw themselves as potential witnesses to the next great unraveling, unless something changed. Older voices, in many cases, resisted the idea, pointing to humanity's resilience and technological problem-solving capacity. "We've faced bigger challenges before and adapted," they insisted. This generational split was mirrored in government halls. Some nations embraced the findings, launching task forces to analyze the city's collapse for actionable lessons. In Scandinavia, policymakers commissioned a report titled Project Continuity, directly inspired by the archaeological data. It outlined strategies for building resource reserves, decentralizing food production, and strengthening civic institutions. In other regions, the reaction was the opposite. Leaders accused the researchers of pushing a collapse narrative to justify political or economic reforms that might threaten entrenched interests. State-controlled media in some countries mocked the idea of comparing a Stone Age civilization to the modern digital world, framing it as pseudo-scientific fear-mongering. Meanwhile, international organizations like the UN found themselves in a delicate position. Officially, they praised the research for its academic merit, but privately, some diplomats worried that publicly endorsing it could fuel panic or political instability. The parallels were unsettling enough that even cautious acknowledgement risked becoming a rallying cry for protest movements already simmering in many countries. Online, the debate turned into a wildfire. Social media threads dissected the city's final century events alongside contemporary headlines. Amateur analysts overlaid graphs from ancient inscriptions with stock market trends and climate data. Conspiracy theories bloomed as well, some claiming the city's fall was triggered by secret knowledge or divine retribution, others suggesting modern governments were intentionally ignoring the warning because they had already prepared escape plans for the elite. The most contentious element of the debate was the question of inevitability. Were we already too far along? The city's chronicles suggested that by the time its leaders recognized the danger, their options had narrowed to desperate symbolic acts. The grand temples and monuments historians now understood as hollow gestures of control. Some feared we were at the same stage too, already fighting to maintain the appearance of stability, unable to enact the deep changes required for survival. Into this charged atmosphere stepped a coalition of scientists, policy experts, and public figures, calling themselves the Continuity Alliance. They argued that while the parallels were alarming, they were also an opportunity. History is not prophecy, their manifesto read. It is a warning. We are not bound to repeat it unless we choose not to learn from it. The alliance began holding public forums, often in cities with strong cultural ties to the ancient world. One memorable event took place in Athens, where speakers addressed thousands in an open-air amphitheater, invoking both the wisdom of classical philosophers and the lessons from the lost city. The speeches were passionate but also practical, detailing steps that could be taken now to prevent a similar fate. Their message resonated with some but provoked backlash from others, who saw it as defeatist or alarmist. One prominent business leader dismissed the movement on live television, saying, "Comparing our interconnected, technologically advanced civilization to a Bronze Age city-state is like comparing a spaceship to a horse cart." Yet when pressed about the fragility of supply chains and environmental stress, he offered no clear rebuttal to the parallels. The tension between these two perspectives began to shape political discourse. In some countries, political parties incorporated the research into campaign platforms, promising to break the cycle of collapse through policy reform. In others, the same research was banned from school curricula, deemed politically subversive. Beyond politics, the debate took on a cultural dimension. Artists, filmmakers, and writers began weaving the lost city's story into their work, using it as both allegory and warning. Documentaries juxtaposed drone footage of the ruins with bustling contemporary cities. Paintings depicted the city's grand plazas overgrown with vines, mirrored with modern skyscrapers crumbling under similar greenery. The divide showed no sign of closing. On one side, those who believed the warning could lead to a more sustainable future. On the other, those who saw it as misplaced fear, distracting from progress. Both sides claimed to be acting in the best interest of humanity's future. And through it all, the ruins remained, silent, unchanging, and immune to our arguments. In their stones was the record of what happened when a civilization ignored the fractures beneath its surface. Whether that record would become our own depended on decisions being made right now, in the boardrooms, parliaments, and living rooms of the modern world. As we move into the next section, the focus will shift to those actively working on solutions, individuals and groups who, armed with the lessons of the past, are trying to alter the trajectory before it's too late. The question that lingers is whether their efforts can match the scale and speed of the challenges we face, or whether they are, like the city's final leaders, already fighting against the inevitable. While the debate raged in headlines and political chambers, another story unfolded in quieter corners of the world, the story of those who refused to accept that collapse was inevitable. They were scientists, engineers, community leaders, and even small-town farmers. They did not all know each other, nor did they operate under one banner, but they shared a common conviction: history's warning was real, and it was not too late to rewrite the ending. Known history often romanticizes heroes who rise after catastrophe, rebuilding from the ashes. The hidden truth is that most heroes never make the history books. They work before the collapse, in anonymity, struggling to prevent disaster that the majority refuses to see. This was the role these modern actors had taken up, knowing they might never be celebrated and might even be ridiculed. One of the most visible of these was Dr. Helena Voss, a climate systems analyst who had become a reluctant public figure after her testimony at the Geneva conference. Voss didn't speak in apocalyptic tones. She spoke in data points, charts, and probabilities. Yet her message was unmistakable. The curve is not fate, it's a choice. If we change inputs, we change outcomes. She spearheaded the Global Resource Resilience Network, a coalition aiming to localize essential production, food, water purification, and energy, so no single point of failure could bring down an entire system. In northern Kenya, a reforestation project run by the group Roots of Continuity was quietly restoring land that had been stripped bare by overuse. Instead of relying on massive centralized funding, they used a decentralized model, individual villages planting indigenous tree species, guided by ancient land stewardship practices revived from oral histories. The parallels to the lost city's agricultural collapse were not lost on the organizers. "We can't control the global markets," said founder Amina Obote, "but we can control the soil under our feet." In Iceland, a team of engineers had turned their attention to food security, building geothermal-powered greenhouses that could operate year-round, insulated from international supply chain shocks. Their work was not just about feeding the local population, it was about proving that technological adaptation could be scaled without exploiting distant resources. What united these diverse efforts was a shared rejection of the idea that salvation would come from a single massive solution, a miracle technology, or grand political alliance. Instead, they worked on creating overlapping, redundant systems, knowing from the archaeological record that civilizations often collapsed, not when one problem arose but when several converged. Some worked in the open, others deliberately kept their efforts low profile, wary of political or corporate backlash. An anonymous network of urban planners shared blueprints for cities designed to survive systemic shocks, incorporating self-contained energy grids, rainwater capture, and vertical farming. The designs were downloaded tens of thousands of times by individuals, communities, and even local governments. But for every project that moved forward, another faced obstruction. Helena Voss's coalition encountered fierce resistance from industries that profited from centralized, fragile systems. Amina Obote's group was denied a major grant after political pressure from agribusiness lobbies. In some countries, grassroots resilience programs were branded as subversive, accused of undermining national unity by promoting self-sufficient cells over state dependency. Despite this, the work continued, fueled by a sense of urgency that came not from abstract ideology, but from the raw evidence of the lost city's fate. Many of these groups kept a replica of the city's final year calendar in their workspaces, a stark reminder of how quickly prosperity can dissolve when pressure builds unchecked. In one striking example, a mid-sized city in Argentina adopted nearly every recommendation from a combined panel of archaeologists, climate scientists, and economists. They restructured their energy systems to be fully renewable and locally sourced, passed strict water use policies, and created neighborhood-level emergency councils modeled on ancient mutual aid systems. Within 5 years, the city became a case study in the UN's Resilient Cities program, proof that the lessons could be implemented in a modern context. These successes, however, were rarely front-page news. They lacked the drama of political confrontation or the simplicity of disaster headlines. Yet, in the quiet, incremental victories, restored forests, stable food supplies, decentralized grids, there was a kind of hope absent from the louder debates. Among the movement's thinkers, a phrase began to circulate: "We are building the lifeboats before the water rises." It was a counterpoint to the more fatalistic voices insisting that humanity's ship was unsinkable. For them, the lifeboats were not physical vessels but social, environmental, and technological systems designed to keep communities afloat when not if large-scale shocks came. Opponents mocked the lifeboat metaphor, saying it implied retreat rather than progress. But those in the movement saw it differently. To them, building lifeboats was the most rational form of progress, creating a future where civilization didn't have to shatter before it could evolve. Still, tension lingered between those who saw resilience as preparation for survival and those who viewed it as the foundation for transformation. Was the goal to endure collapse or to avert it entirely? The ancient city's story offered no comfort here. Its people had attempted both, and the archaeological record suggested they had acted too late on either front. By the end of the decade, the network of individuals and projects had grown. They began sharing a collective archive, compiling both ancient and modern case studies, creating a living document of what worked and what failed. The archive's preface contained a single line: "If we fail, it will not be because we did not know. It will be because we did not act." For those who followed the lost city's tale closely, this line resonated with haunting clarity. The inscriptions found on its final standing walls were not prayers or poetry, but inventory lists, records of dwindling resources, and desperate measures. The people had known, they had written it down. They had still fallen. As we turn to the next section, we will leave behind the present-day efforts and step fully into the most unsettling part of this story, the moment when the ancient city's collapse stopped being a warning and became a lived reality. The archaeological team's final excavation layers, the ones they hesitated to publish in full, will reveal the truth about how fast too late can arrive, and what it looks like when the last systems fail. By the time the excavation team reached the final occupation layers of the ancient city, the pattern was undeniable: a long period of prosperity followed by a swift and catastrophic unraveling. What shocked the archaeologists was not that collapse had come, history has seen that before, but how suddenly it happened. In the deeper layers, life seemed stable, organized, and abundant. Just a few centimeters above, the evidence was of chaos, scarcity, and abandonment. The transition was not measured in centuries, but in seasons. Known history often frames ancient collapses as gradual declines, slow erosion of order over generations. The hidden truth preserved here was different: a tipping point, a threshold crossed so abruptly that even the most prepared citizens may have found themselves swept into disaster before they realized it. The excavation site's final report described the burn layer, a thin band of blackened earth, laced with charcoal, melted pottery, and shattered stone. At first, it was assumed to be the result of invasion, but there were no signs of large-scale weaponry or mass graves typical of conquest. Instead, the destruction bore the marks of internal breakdown: storehouses looted, irrigation systems dismantled, public buildings stripped for parts. This was not the signature of an external army. It was the collapse of trust. Evidence from refuse pits revealed a shift in diet, from diverse agricultural staples to whatever could be foraged or scavenged. The remains of domesticated livestock dwindled rapidly, replaced by bones of wild game, rodents, and even birds of prey, a clear sign of desperation. Seeds found in the last storage jars were a mix of edible grains and inedible weeds, suggesting that fields had gone untended or had been abandoned entirely. One of the most haunting discoveries came from a cluster of houses in the city's eastern quarter. Inside, archaeologists found hastily boarded windows, overturned furniture, and jars sealed but never opened, as if the occupants had prepared to shelter in place only to leave in a rush. On one wall, faintly etched beneath layers of soot, was a single line in the city's script. Though the translation is disputed, the consensus reads, "The council has broken." The council referred to here is believed to have been the city's governing body, an institution that had coordinated trade, resource distribution, and public works for centuries. Its collapse, whether through factional conflict, corruption, or inability to act, may have triggered the rapid disintegration of the city's social fabric. Once the central authority failed, neighborhood-level trust was the only thing left, and even that eroded quickly. Archaeologists found caches of valuables buried in courtyards and beneath floors, never retrieved. This hinted at a pervasive fear of theft, the breakdown of communal norms, and a shift from cooperation to hoarding. In societies on the brink, such changes can be both a symptom and a cause of collapse. The city's ceremonial plaza, once the site of festivals and public gatherings, told another part of the story. In its final days, the plaza appeared to have been repurposed as an open-air market of desperation, makeshift stalls offering scrap goods, scavenged tools, and handfuls of withered produce. The grand stone steps that once hosted orators and dancers were littered with broken cooking pots and animal dung. The heart of civic pride had become a trading post for survival. In one corner of the plaza, a team uncovered what may have been the last public construction project, a hastily built enclosure of stone and timber. The enclosure was incomplete and showed signs of abandonment. Mid-build, the tools left scattered in the dust. Whatever its intended purpose, defense, storage, or containment, it was never finished. Outside the city walls, the story grew even darker. Satellite imaging of the surrounding landscape revealed signs of rapid environmental degradation, diverted river channels, salinized soil from over-irrigation, and massive deforestation. These changes would have compounded the social crisis as food shortages deepened and clean water sources dwindled. The collapse of the city was not simply a political event, it was ecological as well. Perhaps the most chilling discovery came from the archives building, or what was left of it. A cache of clay tablets was found stacked in one of the side rooms, many half-baked and cracked, as if they had been prepared, but never completed. The tablets contained lists not of trade goods or tax records, but of names, possibly citizen registries. The final pages were marked with what appeared to be symbols for absence or loss. The scribes, it seemed, had been trying to account for the missing until the very end. For the archaeologists working in the heat and dust, it was impossible not to feel the human weight of what they uncovered. These were not just artifacts. They were the last fingerprints of a society that had once believed in its own permanence. Standing among the ruins, they could imagine the sounds of the city's final weeks, the hurried footsteps, the whispered arguments, the quiet of streets, once full of life. What made the findings so unsettling to modern historians was how familiar the pattern felt. The sequence, environmental strain, political fracture, economic disruption, loss of trust, was not unique to this civilization. It mirrored events in other ancient collapses, and disturbingly, it echoed certain warning signs in our own time. Yet there was one final revelation the team debated for months before publishing. In a collapsed section of the city's central hall, they found an unfinished inscription carved into the wall. The characters trailed off mid-word. The stone surface left rough and unpolished. The partial translation reads, "We thought we had more time." That single line, incomplete as it was, became the most cited and debated artifact from the entire excavation. Was it a statement from the ruling council, a personal reflection by the artisan, or simply a fragment of a larger text? No one could say for certain, but its meaning resonated far beyond the archaeology community, a reminder that collapse is rarely recognized in the moment and almost never prepared for in time. As we leave this moment in the city's history, the air feels heavy with inevitability. The collapse is complete, the streets are empty, the lifelines have been cut. In the next section, we will follow what happened after the long silence, the centuries of burial, and the rediscovery that brought this civilization's final warning to light. When the last of the inhabitants walked away from the city, whether in desperation, hope, or defeat, they left behind more than buildings and possessions. They left behind a silence so complete, it seemed to swallow time itself. No footsteps echoed in the streets. No fires burned in the hearths. No laughter spilled from the plazas. The wind became the only voice, whispering through empty doorways and broken walls. In known history, ruins often become waypoints for new settlers or scavengers. But here, the hidden truth was stranger. The city was not simply abandoned, it was avoided. Archaeological surveys show no significant resettlement for centuries. Even nomadic groups gave the site a wide berth. It was as if the place had been marked consciously or unconsciously as cursed. The layers of sediment that settled over the city tell a story of slow burial. First came the dust storms, sweeping across the deforested plains, filling courtyards and covering mosaics. Then the river shifted course, depositing silt along what had once been the main thoroughfare. Grasses crept over the plaza, their roots prying apart the carefully laid paving stones. Rainwater pooled in the basins of collapsed roofs, creating stagnant ponds where dragonflies hovered and mosquitoes bred. As decades turned into centuries, the memory of the city faded from oral tradition. In the surrounding valleys, people still spoke of the stone place or the dead road, but no one remembered its name. Myths grew in its absence. Some said a great fire from the sky had destroyed it. Others claimed the gods had taken offense and turned the inhabitants to dust. These stories, embellished with each telling, acted as both warning and explanation, ensuring that few dared to explore the overgrown streets. For nature, the city's silence was an invitation. Trees took root in abandoned courtyards, their branches spreading where roofs had once been. Vines clung to temple walls, covering carvings in a slow green shroud. Birds nested in the crevices of statues, their calls replacing the songs once sung by human voices. Predators prowled the outskirts, claiming the land as their own. By the time centuries had passed, the city had become part of the landscape, not a scar, but a hidden organ beneath the skin of the earth. It is tempting to imagine that in those silent centuries, the city was completely forgotten, but faint traces persisted. Traders passing along distant routes sometimes found shards of pottery far from the site, carried unknowingly in river floods. A few farmers stumbled upon dressed stones while plowing fields, stones too large and finely cut to have been made for farmhouses. These encounters were fleeting curiosities rather than revelations, yet they formed the quiet hum of memory, a sense that something vast and strange lay just beyond the present. The silence was broken only by the forces of nature. Earthquakes toppled more walls, grinding stone into rubble. Floods filled the lower districts with layers of clay and silt, sealing artifacts away like messages in bottles. Lightning strikes scorched the upper terraces, leaving blackened streaks that would one day puzzle excavators. Each event was both destruction and preservation, dismantling the city's surface while safeguarding what lay beneath. One of the most striking aspects of this long silence is how complete it was in human terms, but how dynamic it was in environmental terms. The absence of human activity allowed certain ecosystems to flourish, but it also accelerated the erasure of the city's visible form. Without maintenance, the once grand irrigation channels clogged and collapsed, creating marshlands where fish and amphibians thrived. The air was alive with the sounds of insects, frogs, and birds, a living chorus over the bones of stone. And yet the city was never truly gone. Beneath meters of earth, the streets remained where they had always been. Pots still held grain, tools still rested where they had last been used, and inscriptions still waited on the walls of buried chambers. The silence was a blanket, not an obliteration. The hidden truth that modern archaeologists uncovered, and which historians find most unsettling, is how easily a civilization can disappear from living memory. All it takes is 1 or 2 generations choosing not to return, a few lifetimes of fear or disinterest, and what was once the center of the world becomes no more than a rumor. This phenomenon is not unique to this city, it is a pattern repeated in sites across the world. The unsettling part is that it can happen to any society, even those convinced of their own permanence. Legends from nearby cultures hinted at the city's fate long after it was gone. Some described a people of the sun who built with light-colored stone and could call rain from the skies until they angered the earth. Others spoke of the city that sleeps, said to awaken when the stars align. These myths, though stripped of historical accuracy, preserved an echo of the truth: there had been something here that had ended. Centuries passed. The wider world changed. Empires rose and fell elsewhere. Trade networks shifted. New religions emerged. The abandoned city remained in its green tomb, untouched by these currents. Occasionally, a shepherd seeking shelter from a storm might find a fragment of wall or a shaped stone, but these encounters never spread far. The city kept its secret. It would take an entirely different kind of storm to break the silence, not one of wind or rain, but of human curiosity. As exploration and mapping expanded in more recent centuries, travelers began to note peculiar mounds in the landscape, their shapes too regular to be natural. Some amateur explorers tried digging, uncovering fragments of carved stone or painted pottery. These were brought back to towns and sold in markets, often misidentified as relics from other, more famous sites. And still the city waited. The great unveiling would not come until modern archaeology arrived, armed with new tools, systematic methods, and the will to sift through centuries of sediment. The silence, however, had done its work well. The city that emerged was intact enough to tell its story, and yet mysterious enough to hold on to its deepest secrets. As we prepare to move into the final section, the quiet weight of the centuries hangs over everything. The city's fall is no longer just a matter of broken walls and empty streets. It is a question for us about memory, about fragility, and about how easily the world can forget. In the next section, we will stand in the present day, watching as this lost city steps back into the light, its voice carried once again across the world, not in the bustling conversations of its people, but in the haunting testimony of its ruins. For hundreds of years, the city lay hidden, a ghost beneath the soil. It had been erased from maps, from memory, and from the daily rhythm of human life. Then, one day, a shovel struck stone. It began not with fanfare or formal expeditions, but with an accident. A farmer, digging for a new irrigation trench, uncovered a rectangular slab, too smooth, too precise to be natural. Beneath it, a carved edge appeared, and then another, until a corner of something unmistakably worked by human hands emerged. The discovery might have ended there, buried again after a moment's curiosity, but word spread. Within weeks, a small team of local enthusiasts came to see for themselves. What they found was just the beginning. A collapsed stairway descending into darkness. They brought lanterns and rope, brushing aside centuries of earth to reveal painted walls. The pigments were faded but still vibrant, ochres, blues, and reds that had clung stubbornly to plaster since the day the city fell silent. Geometric patterns intertwined with depictions of people, animals, and rituals. It was as if the city had been waiting, its story pressed like a flower between the pages of time. Known history often tells us that lost cities are rediscovered in grand cinematic moments, explorers emerging from the jungle, gasping at golden temples. The hidden truth is more mundane, yet more haunting. Rediscovery is usually a slow, dusty process. Archaeologists spend years sifting through layers of debris, measuring walls, cataloging pottery shards, and piecing together lives, one fragment at a time. In this city's case, the excavation began with painstaking care. Every shovelful of dirt was sifted, every artifact tagged, every wall stabilized. As the work continued, the city's plan emerged. Wide avenues intersected at precise angles, flanked by multi-story buildings whose stonework still bore the marks of chisels. Central plazas opened onto ceremonial platforms. Irrigation channels, long choked with sediment, traced elegant arcs through the settlement. Beneath the public spaces, narrow tunnels hinted at a hidden infrastructure, perhaps for water, perhaps for ritual. The deeper the excavators dug, the more the silence of the centuries spoke. Bowls still sat where they had been left, in kitchens. Tools leaned against unfinished walls. A loom stood mid-use, its last threads still taut. These were not the relics of a city slowly dying. They were the possessions of a people who had left suddenly, without time to gather the essentials of daily life. Artifacts told a story of sophistication, advanced metallurgy, complex trade networks, and a writing system whose symbols hinted at both administrative records and spiritual texts. But there was also a shadow in these discoveries, abrupt abandonment, signs of fire in some districts, and mass burials in others. The evidence resisted a single explanation, forcing historians to confront uncomfortable possibilities. For modern historians, the city's re-emergence was thrilling and deeply unsettling. The excitement lay in its preservation, the clarity with which its urban planning and artistry could be studied. The unease came from what it implied, that a civilization of this scale and complexity could vanish so completely that even its name was lost. If it happened once, it could happen again. As excavations expanded, the city began to attract global attention. Images of its plazas and temples circulated in magazines and documentaries. Tourists trickled in, eager to stand in the shadow of its walls. Yet, for all the fascination, there was also a quiet debate among experts how much of this city's story should be told. Some argued for caution, noting that revealing too much could invite looting, politicization, or the erasure of its more troubling truths. Others believed that full transparency was the only way to honor its memory. The rediscovery also raised an uncomfortable mirror to our own world. In its heyday, this city had been confident in its permanence. It had vast food stores, monumental architecture, a complex bureaucracy, and cultural achievements unmatched in its region. Its fall had not come from a single obvious blow, but from a convergence of crises: environmental degradation, resource scarcity, political unrest, perhaps even pandemic disease. The parallels to modern vulnerabilities were impossible to ignore. Visitors to the site often describe a strange sensation, a mingling of awe and warning. Walking down the reconstructed streets, they can feel the energy of a once living city, but also the weight of its absence. The stone carvings seem to whisper, not only of what was built, but of what was lost. It is here that the fear historians speak of becomes clear. This is not just a ruin, it is a prophecy. In preserving the city, archaeologists have had to make difficult choices. Reconstruction is partial, guided by evidence, but inevitably touched by interpretation. Some buildings are left as they were found, crumbled, overgrown, and silent, to remind visitors of the city's centuries in the dark. Others are carefully rebuilt, allowing glimpses of its former glory. In both cases, the aim is the same: to hold the city in a delicate balance between past and present, truth and imagination. And yet, despite all the progress in uncovering its secrets, the city resists full understanding. The script carved into tablets remains partially undeciphered. The exact sequence of events leading to its abandonment is still debated. Even its true name remains uncertain. These silences are perhaps as important as the revelations, for they remind us that history is never complete. It is an ongoing conversation between the living and the dead. Today, as researchers continue their work, the city has become both a laboratory and a cautionary tale. It teaches about resilience, innovation, and beauty, but also about fragility, arrogance, and the speed with which the earth can reclaim what is built upon it. In the stone steps worn smooth by ancient feet, in the tools left where hands once worked, in the murals whose colors still cling after 1,000 years, we can see ourselves. The return to light is not just about excavation, it is about re-entering the human story and recognizing that we too are writing chapters that may one day be read, misunderstood, or forgotten. For historians, this awareness is both inspiring and frightening. To stand in the city is to feel the urgency of the present, the knowledge that collapse is not an ancient relic, but a recurring possibility. In the final section, we will step back from the ruins and face the question that has haunted this journey from the beginning. Why does this civilization's fall fill historians with such fear, and what does it say about our own future? From this height, the city is a scar and a memory, a reminder that even the greatest human achievements are temporary. The wind that once carried the voices of merchants, priests, and children now whispers only through empty streets. Historians often speak in the language of analysis, cause, effect, evidence, but when they talk about this city's collapse, the words falter. The facts are there. The environmental strain, the political instability, the sudden departure of its people, yet they do not add up to certainty. What unsettles them most is not just the unanswered questions, but the uncanny resemblance to the world we live in now. The known history says civilizations fall for unique, localized reasons. The hidden truth suggested by this city is that there are patterns, warning signs that appear across time and geography, climate shifts, unequal distribution of resources, overconfidence in technological fixes, widening social divides, and a disconnection between those in power and those they govern. This city experienced all of them, and for a time it adapted, until it didn't. It is this until that terrifies historians. There is no clear moment when the city was doomed, no single day when collapse became inevitable. It was a gradual slide, invisible to those living through it, punctuated by moments of crisis that seemed survivable, until they weren't. As the excavation revealed more about the city's final years, parallels to the present became unavoidable. Here was a society with advanced engineering, extensive trade routes, a rich cultural life, and the ability to shape its environment on a massive scale. Here too were the seeds of decline, depleted farmland, increasingly violent storms, overextended infrastructure, and leaders more focused on monuments than on solutions. Walking through the ruins, it is easy to imagine their last days. Perhaps they told themselves, as we often do, that things would improve, that the shortages were temporary, the unrest a passing phase, the weather an anomaly. Perhaps they believed that their ingenuity would save them, that the city's greatness was proof of its destiny. They could not have known they were living in the final chapter. The rediscovery of the city forces us to confront a possibility we would rather avoid, that we too could be reduced to ruins, that future archaeologists will study with awe and pity. They will read our records digital, if they survive, and marvel at our achievements while asking the same haunting question: why did they let it happen? This is why historians fear this civilization's collapse. Not because it is an isolated tragedy, but because it is a pattern repeating across millennia. The city is not just a warning, it is a mirror. And in that mirror they see our skylines, our highways, our vast networks of trade and communication. They see our reliance on complex systems that could fail in ways we do not fully understand. They see our confidence, and they recognize it. The cinematic power of this story lies in its refusal to be just a story. It demands that we see ourselves not as an exception to history, but as part of it. The stones of this city are not simply relics, they are pages from a book that is still being written. The ending is not fixed, but the possibilities are narrowing. Some will argue that we are different, that our technology, our global cooperation, and our understanding of the past protect us from such a fate. And perhaps they are right. But this city's fall whispers a counterpoint, that complexity is not immunity, and that sometimes the very systems we depend on are the ones most vulnerable to collapse. The fear historians feel is not paralyzing, it is motivating. They know that awareness is the first defense, that studying the past is not an exercise in nostalgia, but a survival strategy. Every excavation, every analysis, every uncomfortable parallel drawn, is an attempt to keep our own story from ending in silence. In the closing moments of the documentary, the camera returns to ground level. We move slowly through the city, past the murals, the plazas, the stairways worn smooth by countless feet. We see the tools left behind, the pottery that once held food, the symbols carved into stone that no one alive can read. The sun sets over the ruins, casting long shadows that stretch toward the horizon, toward us. This city did not believe it could fall, neither do we. But history is not a straight road, it is a cycle. And those who do not listen to the echoes of the past may find themselves repeating its silence. The screen fades to black, leaving only the sound of the wind over ancient stone. The lesson is left unspoken, but it lingers. The collapse of this civilization is not just their story, it might be ours.